Joining us on our webinar tonight for cognition. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how to make the most of your mind. And this webinar is brought to you by CanDo Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Tori Carter, Programs Manager for CanDo MS, and I will be your moderator this evening. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for our cognition webinar. We just want to take a second to recognize our sponsors of this program. I wanted to go over a few functions of Zoom as you guys go through this program tonight. So we have the chat box where you can provide comments and interact with other participants during the program. And then we have our Q&A box where we really want you to send your questions to this box to make sure that we get a chance to see everybody's input and we can use those questions to do a Q&A at the end. We also have a caption feature if you would like to do closed captions during this program. And I would like to introduce our guest speakers tonight. So we have Laura Hancock, a psychologist from Wisconsin, and we have Mathew, who is a speech language pathologist from Atlanta, Georgia. And I will let them talk about themselves for a little bit so they can give you a little sneak peek, and then we will jump right into the program.
Hi, everybody. I am a neuropsychologist working at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Here in Madison, and I've been working with people who have MS for the last 15 years and enjoying every minute of it. I really enjoy helping people with MS, and I'm very delighted to be here tonight presenting with my friend Betty.
Great. Thanks, Laura. I'm Betty. I am a speech language pathologist. I work at the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and I work in our MS rehab department. So I've been there for the last almost 4 years, and it's been a lot of fun and it's been a great learning experience getting to work with our MS clients. So I know Laura and I are both excited to be here tonight to talk about cognition, one of our favorite topics to talk about. All right, so just to get us started, I wanted to go over the learning objectives for tonight. We're going to learn basic facts about cognitive changes in MS and what we know about those cognitive changes. We are going to understand how the cognitive changes are assessed and managed. We're going to understand the impact that the cognitive changes have on someone's employment, their daily life, how independent they are, their relationships, communication skills, all of those things. And then recognize the importance of early screening and getting you the intervention as soon as you can, and kind of what your resources are.
So we also want to take a moment to just kind of explain some basics about cognition. I mean, it sounds like you guys are already familiar with these terms, but we wanted to just go over them quickly. So cognition is our thinking and mental processes, but it's our highest order processes. So these are the most complicated things that our brains do for us every day. And it's the way that we interact with the world because our brains control everything, as you all know. And there are different types of cognitive skills. And as cognitive professionals, we put them into different categories. And those categories are generally attention, executive function, memory, language, spatial skills, and motor skills. So I'll give you a couple of examples from each. So our attention skills are things like our ability, our attention span, our speed with which we can make a response, pull out a memory, what have you. And to some degree, working memory is also usually categorized under attention. So that's our ability to hold a small amount of information in your mind for a short period of time. For people of a certain age like me, you might remember having to look up a phone number in one place of the room and walking across the room before you could dial it. So your working memory would help you keep that phone number in your head for that long. Executive functions are the most complex tasks that our brains perform. So that's things like planning, reasoning, solving a problem, applying judgment in situations. Memory skills involve just that, the 3 phases of memory, which is learning, storage, and retrieval. So that retrieval or recall is what most people think of when they think of memory or having a problem with memory. It's when you go in to pull out a person's name, or you want to think about a joke that you heard a few days ago. You're trying to pull it from your memory store. And then language skills are somewhat self-explanatory, but our language skills are actually very complex and encompass a fairly large amount of square footage in the brain, so to speak. Our brain is not measured in square feet, but that's the word my brain is coming up with at this moment. So the space that's dedicated to language in our brains is actually very large. Our brains do a lot of complex processing to understand the language that is spoken by others or in a written form, or to be able to think about what you want to say and formulate sentences and then say those words. Spatial skills are our brain's ability to understand where objects are in space around us and what those objects are. You could also think of, real world spatial abilities as, being able to efficiently pack a grocery bag or pack a trunk. And then motor skills, our brain also helps us control our motor skills, as you know. So being able to have control of fine motor skills, to execute handwriting, but also the strength of our skills and the coordination of that motor skill. Next slide. So we know from research that up to 70% of people living with MS will experience cognitive difficulties that are related to MS. And as we saw in the poll earlier, that slowed speed of thinking and word finding difficulty are two of the most common cognitive symptoms that we see in clinic. Memory problems are also up there, and those working memory issues, like I mentioned before, sort of forgetting someone's name right after they tell you, or not being able to remember a phone number you just looked up. And what we know about, well, what I like to teach my trainees is once they've met and helped one person with MS, they have met and helped one person with MS, because no two people with MS are alike. And that bears out in terms of the cognitive symptoms that people experience. So Betty and I both have patients who experience cognitive difficulties even before they know they have MS. Or maybe there are people who live with MS for 20 years before they start to notice changes in cognition, and everything in between. So we can't always predict how someone is going to experience any cognitive changes related to MS. Next slide. So as we were saying too, the cognitive symptoms, not only do they vary in terms of when or if they show up for a person, but they also vary very significantly in the severity. So many people will only experience very mild changes that might be bothersome and frustrating, but don't limit their day-to-day activities, and may not necessarily limit their ability to work. But that's not true for every person. And these cognitive symptoms often have a major impact on the quality of someone's life, which is why we're here today, because we want to teach you about it so that we can arm you with things that you can do to try to maintain or improve the quality of your life. So we know that sometimes cognitive symptoms can limit work-related tasks, can cause problems at work, interfere with family-related tasks. Like sometimes I've had patients in my clinic who are, accidentally forgetting about an appointment that for a family member that they were going to attend, or maybe their own appointments that are important to them. And these symptoms can be quite frustrating and hard to cope with, but there are interventions that we can do that Betty's going to talk about next. And we just want you to know that if you're experiencing some of these symptoms, there's something that we can do and we can intervene and help, and you don't just have to live with them.
Yeah. So to piggyback off of what Laura said, she said it was a great description of what's going on cognitively in our clients with MS. We do know that we can have positive changes with intervention or rehabilitation. So that's what we want to kind of go next. And as someone who works in the rehab setting, I'm a speech language pathologist. I get to work with patients every day and kind of figure out what those interventions look like. And, I really like what Laura said, when you work with one person with MS, you've worked with one person with MS, everyone's so different. So intervention and rehab can look very different from person to person. So that's very important to keep in mind. That there are some very general things that anyone can do and that can show improvement in their cognitive function or lessen the impact of that issue or difficulty. So studies show that we can lessen the impact of cognitive changes for people living with MS by making some of the following lifestyle changes. So getting plenty of sleep, about 7 to 9 hours. We know how fatigue plays such a big role in our lives. It's probably one of the bigger barriers that I hear about every day from our clients. So getting plenty of sleep. And I would even say even taking regular rest breaks throughout the day as well can be very, very beneficial. I know sleep can be very challenging for this population. So it may just be trying to take those breaks throughout the day whenever possible, scheduling those breaks so you can, be consistent. Getting regular exercise. Now that can look different for everybody depending on, your MS. So it could be stretching. Even just stretching daily can be very, very helpful. Just not being as stiff and just moving your body a little bit. So the recommendation can be 150 minutes total a week. Now, that doesn't mean to do all 150 minutes in one sitting. We do have to pace ourselves. So it could be broken up into, over the course of 5 days, 30 minutes each day. So that's definitely something that can be beneficial. Limiting or stopping cigarette and or marijuana smoking. We know that can decrease some of the symptoms that our MS clients feel. Having healthier eating habits. That's crucial. Nutrition is huge. Nutrition can impact, how we sleep and our energy levels. It can impact just how we feel physically. If we're eating a ton of processed or sugary foods, we're going to feel bad later. It may give us that burst of energy in the moment, but we can feel a decline later. So having some good, healthy eating habits, and I would even add on having good hydration and having good water intake as well. Having regular cognitive and social stimulation, and that can look different for everybody. That really just depends on each individual person's lifestyle and where they're at in life, but just having that regular life participation can be very beneficial for anyone that has MS. And then last but not least is managing emotional symptoms. We know there's a huge link between mood and cognition, so if you're maintaining your mood and taking care of yourself and balancing stress and things like that, that can actually impact and improve our cognitive function. Next slide. All right, so what can working with a rehab professional do? What does that help our people with MS, improve on? So it can help strengthen our skills. It can help us learn new ways to compensate. Sometimes with MS, there are skills that we may not be able to gain back, but it can help us compensate. We can teach you how to compensate and work around those areas. We can develop new strategies. Rehab professionals are very creative people. We can definitely find different workarounds, different apps, different tools to help you function better and complete those tasks that you need to get done. It can help you gain confidence and increase your self-efficiency. So once people start to lose function, they can feel, very much like they can't do it anymore. And we lose confidence. We just don't believe in ourselves as much. So rehab professionals are great at helping you gain that confidence, learn those strategies, and find new ways to go about those familiar tasks. And then, of course, just be able to live your best life despite living with MS. People with MS lose a lot of control over what they can and can't do. So I like to think that as rehab professionals, we kind of put some more control back into your hands to help you gain, more independence and improve your quality of life. All right, so who are these rehab professionals? They help you work on cognition, just very much like a PT would help you with your physical function. So it's just kind of doing like PT for your brain. So it varies from healthcare system to healthcare system. So you might be able to find one or all of these professionals close by. So that would be someone like me, a speech language pathologist. Occupational therapists are also very helpful with treating cognition. A rehabilitation psychologist or a neuropsychologist like our very own Laura. So these are the types of professionals that you can seek out in your community that can help you get going on this process, this journey of working on your cognition. So next slide. All right, so now that we know what the what cognitive changes are, who can help you, the next question is, well, how do I know that I have these issues? How do I detect the issues? Some common things that people will notice are making mistakes with bills or paperwork. You know, maybe you added something up wrong, or maybe you forgot to pay a bill, things like that. Trouble recalling a conversation. That could be a conversation you've had 10 minutes ago, or even from the day before or last week. Trouble finding the right word or substituting words. Lauren mentioned earlier how complex like language and communication is, and that's a big part of what our community can struggle with, is finding the right word, organizing your thoughts. Oftentimes I hear, I know what I want to say, but I can't get it out. So that's kind of that word finding issue that people will have. Many life factors can interfere with our optimal condition. So life factors can be anything like I mentioned earlier, the change in mood, your increased stress. Maybe we're having difficulty coping with the diagnosis or any kind of monumental changes in our life. Maybe it's changing your work status. You know, it was mentioned earlier that, you know, that's somewhere where you can see a big change. Sometimes people have to leave the workforce. Maybe they're going from full-time to part-time. Maybe they're changing their career completely because of these ongoing changes. So coping with that can be challenging. Even just changes in your day-to-day function or how independent you are. Maybe you find yourself having to rely more on your family or a friend, and those kind of life factors can interfere with how we function. So the best way to know whether there are concerning cognitive symptoms is to have your skills screened or evaluated. So we'll talk more about who you would go to get those answers. All right.
So now,
Laura.
Sorry, didn't mean to talk over you.
No, go ahead.
So what we're going to do now is walk through some example cases. So these are not real people. These are some examples told through the lens of a person, so that you can see how these symptoms might come about in your own life and how they're managed and dealt with by different professionals that you might encounter. So Maria is a 39-year-old woman who has had MS for the last 10 years. And lately she's noticed that she's making some more mistakes in her work as an accountant. She has noticed that things seem to take her longer to do. So tasks that she's been routinely doing for a long time seem to take longer than normal. She has difficulty finding the right word that she wants when she's in a meeting or talking with coworkers. She also recently completely forgot about a deadline, which she's never done before in the 15 years that she's worked for her employer. These changes are frustrating to her, and she's starting to get worried about them. So on the next slide, I want you to think about and respond to, what should Maria do? What action should she take? Should she discuss with her neurologist? Should she decide to go part-time at work, reach out to friends and family for support, or ask her employer for help and for more time completing tasks? All right, so we've got the answers. Ooh, most of you said she should discuss with her neurologist. I like that. And the next most popular answer was ask her employer for help and more time completing tasks. So only a few responses on the other two, but I will say none of these courses of action are wrong. But I like what you're thinking in terms of going with a neurologist. So on the next slide, we're going to see what Maria did. So Maria decided to make an appointment with her neurologist to talk about her concerns. So again, the 4 responses that you were choosing from, none of them were wrong answers or a wrong way to go. But in this case example, Maria decided to talk to her neurologist. And when she did that, her neurologist decided to place a referral to neuropsychology. So she meets with Dr. Smith, who's the neuropsychologist who regularly works with the neurologist's patients. So she regularly sees people with MS. At their first visit, what will happen is Dr. Smith will talk to Maria and ask about her bothersome symptoms, collect important information about those symptoms, like how long have they been going on? Are they getting worse over time? Are they getting better over time or staying the same? And then she's also going to collect important information about Maria's medical and psychiatric history, also things like her school history and how other things have been going at work. Maria is welcome to bring her spouse or loved one to that appointment to help Maria express herself and make sure that she's getting her concerns across to the neuropsychologist. And then either in the same visit, possibly in a separate visit, Dr. Smith or a psychology technician that's called a psychometrist will administer tests that measure cognitive skills. So most of these tests are still pretty old school, I like to call it. A lot of them are kind of paper and pencil, sort of question and answer type format. Some tests are administered by with the help of like an iPad or a computer, but the vast majority of them are still, or at least in my clinic, they're still paper and pencil format. The tests will vary in terms of style, in terms of difficulty. So the tests are designed to measure the functioning of all of those different networks of the brain that we talked about earlier. So the test will ask you to do things like remember something, repeat something, draw something maybe. And so it's really going to run the gamut in terms of variety of different kinds of things that you're asked to do. And the person who's giving you the tests, their job is, they can't take the tests for you, but their job is to make sure that you understand what you're being asked to do. Because I don't want to measure how confused you are by the instructions. I want to measure how well your brain can perform that task, because that's going to help me understand what you need and understand both your strengths and your weaknesses, because we want to use your strengths to your advantage in order to help you get back to doing what you want to do or help deal with this issue that led you to the appointment in the first place. And it's important to know that, can you go back one slide, please? No one gets everything answered or gets everything right or correct. So I think people, if there's people here in the webinar who've done this before, you probably understand now what that experience is like. But before you go in to have this kind of evaluation, you really have no frame of reference for what it's going to be like. And it can be a little intimidating. And I think most people feel like, oh, I should be getting everything right. But you don't need to. So the tests were designed to max out your best possible skill. The tests are designed to be harder than any person can do, even on their best day. So don't feel bad if you feel like, ooh, I think I missed that item. And like I said, many people tell us that taking the tests is interesting and different, even if some items are challenging, and testing will be tiring. So when Maria takes these tests, or when any other person takes these tests, they're mentally tiring because we're asking your brain to perform tasks that it doesn't normally do. And when you are a person living with MS, you're coming to the evaluation already with a certain level of fatigue that is just going to increase during the course of the evaluation. So in this scenario, Dr. Smith might need to break the testing into 2 separate appointments so that Maria doesn't get too tired by the tests. Now we can do the next slide. So then what will happen is once Dr. Smith has all of the data from the tests, she'll meet with Maria to review the results, explain what they mean, and go over her recommendations and suggestions to help Maria with her symptoms. So for Maria, she was having difficulty with slowed processing speed and the efficiency of her learning. So Dr. Smith will then schedule follow-up sessions with Maria to help her work on rehabilitating those weaknesses and learn some new skills to try to compensate for those weaknesses. And Dr. Smith is also going to communicate back to the neurologist or primary care if needed in order to keep everyone on the same page so everyone knows how best to help Maria.
All right, so now we have another kind of case to discuss. So thank you, Laura, for yours. It was very helpful to hear that. So now we're going to consider John. He's a 53-year-old man who has had MS for 20 years. He's been having significant difficulty with cognition lately, so he took an early retirement option from his job as a computer programmer a year ago. He was finding that even simple tasks were taking him a long time to complete. He is also finding that he has difficulty communicating with his spouse. Words are coming very slowly and he can be difficult to understand. So he's also having trouble helping around the house with chores like paying the bills on time, taking care of things like that. And then these changes have become really frustrating and worrisome for John and his family. All right, so let's see what happens with John. So John's spouse makes an appointment with his neurologist to talk about his concerns. His neurologist decides to give John a quick test or screener to help determine what they should do next. So some of you guys may have already done that with your neurologist. They may have given you, a simple memory task like tell me, 3 words and then remember to tell me them at the end of the session or something like that to kind of assess that cognition, something very surface level and brief. John is asked to remember some words, name some objects, and draw a few things. The neurologist, Dr. Jones, is concerned because of the results, and he decides to refer John to work with a speech language pathologist who sees, some of the other patients. Go to the next slide. All right, so then John gets to meet Tammy, who's a speech language pathologist. They meet with Tammy and they discuss their concerns, and Tammy gets additional information. So Tammy's going to get information like, when did he get diagnosed with MS? What are the areas that he's having difficulty with? How is it impacting his day-to-day life? Tammy would even probably ask about his work, like what responsibilities did he have at work? How is it impacting him? What was he able to do and not able to do? The more information Tammy gets about John's career, his day-to-day life, his responsibilities, the more she can kind of figure out how to assist him and come up with some functional goals. So then Tammy decides to administer a series of tests to take a closer look at the cognitive skills. They're very similar to the ones that a neuropsychologist like Laura would use, and it can vary in difficulty, and they are most often paper and pencil format. And there's a variety of them. So no one speech language pathologist will probably give the same test. It just depends. So we would score the test. We would, look at the results. And using those results, Tammy is going to work with John and the spouse to make a treatment plan to discuss the areas of weakness and areas of concern. So something to what Laura said, we're going to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, and we're going to try and see how those strengths can help offset those weaknesses. So it's not to point out what you are or aren't doing. It's looking at those patterns to help, improve John's quality of life. So Tammy will communicate progress back to the neurologist and continue to monitor John as well. The frequency of therapy will be established. I mean, it can vary. It can be from 1 time a week, maybe twice a week. So it really just depends on the client, John, what his needs are, and Tammy as well, and what she's able to help him with. Next slide.
All right, so I'm going to go over our third case here. which is a little bit of a different case. So this is the case of Dominique. She is a 30-year-old woman who has had MS for 8 years. She's a stay-at-home mom and has 2 young children who are 7 and 4. She's been noticing some issues lately, like missing healthcare or other appointments for her children, which is not typical for her. She feels very scattered and foggy. And she recently forgot that she agreed to make crafts for a PTA event, which again is not like her. These changes are frustrating, but she isn't really that worried because she's really busy. And even though her spouse has mentioned these issues to her on several occasions, she kind of is chalking it up to being busy for now. Next slide. So eventually she attends a follow-up appointment with her primary care provider over the summer. And when she's there, she mentions it. Her primary care provider, who also manages her MS, gives her a brief screening test where she gets a perfect score. However, she also takes a screening test for depression, and that screening test was positive, meaning that her score was high enough that she might have diagnosable clinical depression. So the primary care offers some medication and or psychotherapy to address those depression symptoms. And Dominique decides to start with medication and see how that goes. And at her next follow-up with the primary, she gives the depression screener again, and Dominique's score improved. And she also tells the primary care that with that improvement in those symptoms at the same time, her cognitive symptoms have gotten better. She's not forgetting as much and she feels less foggy and scattered. Next slide. This is an important case for us to discuss because like Betty alluded to earlier, there are a lot of other factors that can influence how well your brain can perform and how well your brain can sort of be at its best. So those factors that you just try to start thinking about them now, but depression is one of them. So as we saw in Dominique's case, what seemed like they were probably cognitive issues due to MS actually were being caused by depression. So Betty mentioned some of those factors earlier, and I'm wondering if you guys can kind of throw in the chat, what were they? Besides depression, what were those other factors that we mentioned that can negatively influence cognition? Dehydration, stress, poor diet, decreased sleep, smoking, medications. Yep, absolutely. Marijuana, fatigue. You got it.
Yeah, these are all great answers. It can be a big factor too. Yeah. I've heard that come up quite a bit lately in my practice as well. Talk about the impact of those cognitive symptoms. And I think we've kind of built upon that this whole, in the last half an hour or so. So as you saw with our cases, these symptoms can have a wide range of impact on people's lives. Some can experience a few symptoms and it's frustrating, but it's manageable. Some people may have symptoms that cause a lot more of an impact, losing a job, causing tension or stress in marital and other important relationships, losing your ability to drive or be independent, and just have a lot more significant changes to important life roles. So, our goal here at Can Do is to help you take action to address those factors that you can control to the degree that you can. It's going to be hard to be able to do it all, but we definitely want to give you all the tools, encourage you guys to advocate for yourself so that you can take action and get some of that control back into your hands. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is just kind of a great little visual of some contributing factors to help promote having a healthy brain. So we want to, like Laura mentioned, your mental health, mood can be such a big contributing factor to having, balance in your life and having healthy cognitive function, having good nutrition, Like I said before, eating whole foods. I know there's a lot of diets and things out there, and you'll have to do research on that and talk to maybe your neurologist or a dietitian and figure out, what is the best type of healthy eating habit. It can vary, especially if you have diabetes or other comorbidities going on. Definitely do your research about what is the best eating habit for you. Exercise. We mentioned earlier, exercise can look different for everybody. So sometimes just stretching every day can be extremely beneficial. Maybe going on a short walk or, getting involved in like a wellness program, in your community. That can be really beneficial as well. Getting involved in cognitive rehab, that can also be beneficial as well. Finding out who in your community or who in your healthcare system is available to you, and maybe getting that referral going. I was looking through the comments and a lot of you guys are saying like, you haven't had that referral made or no one's given you that suggestion. So I think coming away from this webinar, maybe looking to get that referral and asking for it the next time you're at your neurologist's office. Sleep is so important. It's so important for our brains to get rest. We can't function without good sleep. And I know that's a big barrier for a lot of people. So maybe you've struggled with sleep and maybe it's time to revisit that conversation with your provider and maybe taking a look at your current habits and seeing what can be changed. So maybe it's a good time to revisit it if it's been a while, having that discussion. Social connection, having a good support system, and it doesn't mean having this intense group of people around you, a large number of people. It could just be 2 or 3 people that you can rely on and that can help you and can help advocate for you. Quality over quantity is what I always tell people. So if you have a few people in your life that you can support you through this process and what you're going through, then I think that's great. And then obviously evaluation and screening, getting those tests and screeners done and being consistent with it, keeping up with those appointments with your neurologist, trying not to skip them, getting those MRIs completed and just maintaining, those appointments is critical for tracking these changes. Next slide. All right, so I think we have some key takeaways and I'll kind of start, and Laura, you can jump in, but so far what we've learned is cognitive symptoms can be evaluated, they can be managed, and there's several professionals out there. So that includes speech language pathologists, an OT or occupational therapist, neuropsychologists, and or rehabilitation psychologists. So there are people there, and I know that people are coming from different backgrounds, different cities. So we encourage you to kind of get out there into the community and see who's around you. It doesn't have to be just a speech language pathologist. If you can't find somebody like that, find an occupational therapist. So keep looking to see who's out there in your community.
And we want to strongly encourage you to talk to your neurologist, your primary care provider, or really any one of your healthcare providers if you have concerns about your cognition. I saw some comments in the chat, although I can't read all of them while we're presenting, but I did see some comments in the chat saying, well, my doctor doesn't offer to do this for me, or I did have one of those evaluations, but I never heard what the results were. And so this kind of ties in with another point we want to make to you, which is, unfortunately, sometimes all the providers who might be in your area or who might be contracted with your health insurance plan may not be the type of providers that Betty and I work with, or who Betty and I are in our practice. And so sometimes what you have to do is really advocate for yourself and stand up for yourself. And that's okay to do in the healthcare setting. I know it feels like you shouldn't, or it would be nice if your doctor was offering you these things, but sometimes you need to put it on their radar, and that's okay. And if you talk to your primary care and they don't take action, then don't be afraid to bring it up to a different provider so that you can get some action taken. And it's going to take some investigation on the part of either the neurologist or the cognitive professional that you go to see to figure out, okay, so are these issues that you're experiencing, are they from your MS, or are we seeing the effects of this untreated depression that hadn't been discovered yet? Or are we seeing the effects of a sleep disorder that you didn't know you had? And so if you're willing to go with some workup, maybe some different kinds of tests, then we can find out what's going on and get to the bottom of it.
Definitely. So like Laura said, you know, definitely advocating. If your doctor's not initiating it, ask for it. Ask for that screening to get even just that initial piece of information so that you can start that intervention. You know, even if you are so many years post your diagnosis, it's still worthwhile to get screened and get tested. I don't think it's ever too late to ever learn a strategy or change how you're doing something or make any of those, one of those lifestyle changes we've talked about. It can make an incremental change in your life. And then feel empowered to take control of those factors as you can, you know, like getting more exercise and doing more of those cognitively engaging tasks. So in the meantime, if you're waiting to get in with your neurologist, or, you know, maybe you're waiting to start therapy, you know, there are things that you can start kind of doing and getting that ball going. So you're not just doing it all at once, because those are a lot of changes to make all at one time. So I always tell people, you know, start with one or two things, if that, and start to kind of implement it into your life, and then slowly add things as you go. Adding or making all those changes all at once can be really, really challenging. It can also be really defeating as well. So always pick one or two from that previous diagram that we had and go from there.
Yeah, I like to think about you're kind of setting yourself up to fail if you try to change too many things at once, because our human nature is to reject change. As you probably know. And sometimes I think about it like, if you've ever watched those shows where, you know, someone comes in and tries to like change the way a family eats to make them healthier. And, you know, the kind of show where they like take everything out of the refrigerator and replace it with green leafy vegetables, and take everything out of the pantry and replace it with stuff that the family has never seen. And basically then the show is about how people struggle to adapt to that change. So we are much more likely to be able to make and hold a change and maintain that change if we take little tiny baby steps towards the changes that we want to make. So even if you have to break one change down into lots of different parts, who cares how many parts you need to break it into? It doesn't matter if you break it into 10 parts or 100 parts, because then you can take each one of those smaller steps and make progress and success and be able to pat yourself on the back along the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so Tori's going to join us now to moderate some questions.
All right, everybody. That was a really great presentation. You guys taught me a lot, and I really appreciated everything that you guys put into that. So yeah, we'll do some Q&A. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing so you can see our wonderful speakers. So I have one that could be for either of you. What do you recommend for cognitive stimulation, whether it's, you know, what kind of forms would you recommend? And do you have anything more specifically that you would recommend?
I can start. I know Laura and I are kind of on the same page about this. So there's a lot out there. You know, not all of it is, you know, it's hard to get data for that and what's really going to show, you know, improvement over time. But like specific things that I've recommended is things like Brain HQ and Elevate Brain Training. Those are two great virtual computer-based or app-based apps that I will recommend, or I've had patients actually tell me that they really enjoy using. So I don't know, Laura, if you've had any other.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if you want to use some kind of computerized program that's going to challenge you, those, I don't know as much about Elevate, but Brain HQ has some pretty good research behind it in other groups of people. And there's sort of a building literature now on people with MS. But you don't necessarily have to invest any money in something like Brain HQ or Elevate if you don't want to. So the research tells us that people who are keeping their minds active are sort of, to really reduce it down to its basic parts, are better off in the long run cognitively. So they tend to have healthier brains. They tend to have better sustained cognitive skills, even as people are aging. So you want to, I worry about my patients who have to stop working because they can't anymore because of their MS symptoms, or even, people who've retired at the age they wanted to retire. If you stop using your brain in the same ways and like having mental challenges, you're not exercising your mind, just like you need to exercise your body. So for me, cognitive activity would be almost anything except something really passive like watching television. So that might be, for you, it might be crossword puzzles or jigsaw puzzles or Sudoku puzzles. It might be learning something new, auditing a class at your local college or university. You can often do that for free, and you get to go learn from someone who loves to teach and who wants interested learners in the class. You can watch TED Talks. You can watch master classes on YouTube. The sky is the limit in terms of the things you can do to keep your mind engaged.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I have another one that I think would be definitely geared towards Betty. So somebody asked more specifically, how can a speech language pathologist help with word finding? Like, to give an example for them to understand.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think it depends on the situation you're in. If you are someone in the workforce who's maybe giving presentations or doing something structured, I always advise people to have a script, have notes written down or take notes. So any kind of structured activity, if you can have a template or a script, that's going to be super helpful in those situations. In spontaneous, more general conversation, that's always going to be a little bit harder, and it's going to depend on the environment. It can even depend on stress levels, and if you feel like you're on the spot. I mean, all those things can kind of cause us to be flustered or frazzled and kind of slow down our processes. So I always tell people to slow down, think about your pace. I think we all tend to maybe talk a little bit quicker and faster. So slowing down, pacing yourself. I always tell patients too to think about the end game. Think about your communication goal. What are you trying to say? Is it more important that you get the exact word out, or is it more important that you get that general idea or thought out? So sometimes I think we get stuck on, I really want to say this specific word, and we kind of hit this, wall. And the more we try and think about it, we get frustrated. And I think frustration is a huge barrier when it comes to word finding. So take a step back, think about the goal of your communication and what you're trying to say, and go about it that way versus trying to be very specific. And that can usually help people navigate those instances. So that's what I would typically recommend.
Absolutely. And I think we have time for one more question that I'll throw to Laura. But how do you navigate having cognitive challenge in like social situations and social instances?
Well, actually, I think some of the tips Betty just gave absolutely apply in social situations as well, where speaking and coming up with the words you want to say are often a highlight of that social interaction. And I think too, some of this comes down to the type of social situation you're in and your willingness to communicate with your circle of people, whether that's friends, family, acquaintances, that you're dealing with MS and who you are. And if you say the wrong word, people are often very forgiving. So when you're going into a social situation, again, it depends, if you're going into a room of strangers, that's a different thing. But like Betty said, you have to think about, what is your goal for that event? Is your goal to go and listen? Is your goal to go and, get up in the front of the room on the stage and do the best karaoke out of anyone there, or someplace in between? And try to take steps to help you feel like you're going to accomplish that goal. And you can have a little script in your head of things that you want to say about yourself, how you're going to introduce yourself to people you don't know, how you want to interact, who you want to interact with. And to think about too, that all of the other people in that room, even if they don't have MS, are coming in with the same goals. You know, so Betty and I sometimes go to social situations where we think, you know, I want to spend more time listening tonight than talking, or I really just want to talk to my best friend. And so I'm going to find a way to, you know, go over into a corner of the room and just have a conversation with my best friend and not necessarily worry about the other people in the room. But if you find yourself feeling nervous or on edge or anxious regularly in social situations, and if that is causing you to cancel plans a lot, to limit your activities, and to stop doing things that you used to do, that might be an indication to talk to your primary care. If you don't have a mental health provider, to get a mental health provider to talk about that anxiety in those situations, because social anxiety is a real thing, but it's also a very treatable thing. And just because someone has MS doesn't mean that we can't also help you treat your anxiety or treat your depression if you have depression.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we got to squeeze those questions in there. Let me go ahead and throw us back into the presentation just to wrap up. Don't forget, we do have a Your Questions Answered program later in the month, so you can kind of bring all of your cognitive questions or cognition questions to that program, and we can kind of dive into it a little deeper. So, you know, make sure you connect with us on social media. We will be connecting with all of you via email to share a survey. There will also be a survey opportunity after this program once it closes, so that you can give us your feedback to help us continuously improve the programs. It also really helps us with our funding to make sure we can keep doing or always do these programs for free. So thank you guys so much for your participation in that process. And then we would like to thank our sponsors once again. And then, of course, we want to thank our speakers that we had tonight. Thank you so much, Laura and Betty, for joining us. You guys have been awesome, and I really appreciate everything you did and put into this program.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for asking us to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Great. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.